In popular culture, the cruel mother-in-law is a familiar trope. History has certainly cast Sara Delano Roosevelt in that exact role, painting her as a woman who relentlessly interfered, controlled, and outright stripped her daughter-in-law Eleanor of her rights as a wife and mother. Yet there is a paradox hidden behind these stories. Every powerful matriarch was once a vulnerable young bride. Why is it that instead of freeing one another, they so often choose to inflict the exact same wounds they once had to endure? Today we are going to look closely at the chilling psychological tactics Sara used to suffocate not only Eleanor's life, but every relationship around her. However, we are not opening this chapter of history simply to condemn Sara as a wicked woman. We are doing it to uncover a painful truth about how women found themselves trapped in a highly sophisticated patriarchal system, forced to live in an illusion of power with no real way out. The scarcity of power and the men who held it. When Mr. James Roosevelt took his final breath in 1900, New York's elite waited in hushed anticipation for the reading of his will. By the usual standards of aristocratic families, everyone assumed that the financial empire and the prestigious Springwood estate would be handed down to his eldest son. The young man carried the Roosevelt name and the heavy burden of continuing the family line, but the contents of the will upended all the rules. James left total control of his vast fortune, his lucrative investment portfolios, and the throne of Springwood to his widow, Sara Delano Roosevelt. The privileged young Franklin, despite being a man in a society designed to prioritize male heirs, found himself in a peculiar position. He did not inherit his father's wealth. For most of his life, the future president of the United States would have to rely on an allowance doled out from his mother's silk purse. On the surface, this might look like a triumph for a woman. But beneath that surface, it exposes a core truth about the patriarchal system of the time. In a world built by and for men, a woman's power and status were rarely her own. They had to be established, validated, and maintained through the men in her life. First her father, then her husband, and finally her son. When James died, Sara lost the greatest shield she had ever known. To maintain her grip on her social standing, she poured all of her status, her ambitions, and her life force into the only man she had left, Franklin. Her son was not just her only child. He was a scarce resource. He was the sole anchor keeping her at the center of power and respectability. And then Eleanor arrived. Between 1903 and 1905, a young woman named Eleanor stepped into Franklin's life. She carried the Roosevelt name, but she belonged to a branch of the family that had fallen on hard times. She was orphaned, she was shy, and in Sara's eyes, she was certainly not a natural continuation of the family life cycle. Nor was she simply a girl making her son happy. She was an invader. Eleanor was stepping into a territory of affection, loyalty, and decision-making that Sara had painstakingly built and ruled with absolute authority. The mistress of Springwood did not react with petty, spontaneous jealousy. She launched a cold and highly calculated campaign of defense. From the very early days, Sara used her authority, her money, and the sharp wit of a seasoned society woman to overpower her future daughter-in-law. She would smile gently, while delivering words sharp as a razor, criticizing Eleanor's plain appearance. She forced the young couple to postpone their wedding for an entire year, hoping the distance would quietly kill the romance. And she subtly reminded this orphaned girl that she would never be quite excellent or strong enough to stand beside her prince. This dynamic quickly turned into a suffocating psychological war with no end in sight. If the family was an arena for resources, Sara was determined not to yield a single inch. She viewed her harshness not as a flaw, but as a tool for survival. Years later, Eleanor would bitterly confess in letters to her friends that in her own home she felt like nothing more than a breeding machine. The person who actually played the role of mother, the one who dictated the lives and futures of those children, was Sara. This was not just random personal animosity. Sara was doing exactly what the system had taught her to do. To protect her own position, a woman with power had to oppress the woman of the next generation, turning her daughter-in-law into a permanent dependent rather than agreeing to share the throne. Eleanor did not just marry into a prominent family. She was thrown into a psychological battlefield where she had been stripped of all her weapons before the war even began. The unequal marriage and the price of an only child. To understand why Sara possessed such extreme possessiveness, a psychological shadow that cast itself over all her relationships, we have to turn the clock back to October of 1880. At the age of 26, an age considered slightly past her prime among the Gilded Age elite, Sara Delano walked down the aisle with James Roosevelt. The groom had just turned 52. He was exactly the same age as Sara's own father. This massive generational gap had been a topic of fervent gossip, politely masked behind gracious smiles in the velvet-lined drawing rooms of high society. Even though her father, Mr. Warren Delano, initially objected to this stark age difference, the machinery of high society eventually pushed the marriage forward in exchange for the guarantee of class and immense wealth. Sara, like so many women of her era, entered a marriage where her core value was strictly limited to a single mandate. She had to produce an heir. and then in January of 1882, a true nightmare unfolded. Her labor dragged on for more than 24 agonizing hours. A massive 10-pound baby was stuck and refused to emerge. The air in the bedroom grew thick with panic. The doctors, in a desperate attempt, had to administer heavy doses of chloroform. This was a highly risky anesthetic at the time, and it plunged Sara into a deep coma, pushing her to the very brink of death. When the doctor finally managed to pull the fragile infant from his mother's body, the room fell dead silent. The little boy was blue, breathless, and lifeless. In that fragile moment between life and death, the doctor began performing frantic resuscitation, continuously forcing air into those tiny lungs until a weak cry finally pierced the room. The child lived, but the mother's body was shattered beyond repair. As soon as Sara regained consciousness, the doctor delivered a cold and medical ultimatum. She must absolutely never get pregnant again. Any future childbirth would be an automatic death sentence. That harrowing medical trauma is the most crucial psychological clue to understanding the next 6 decades of the Roosevelt family. Franklin was not just a normal son. He was a life bought with blood. He was the sole hope and the only chance Sara had to fulfill her duty to the lineage and secure her irreplaceable position within the family. From that moment on, a psychological trap snapped shut. Sara dismissed the white-aproned wet nurses and insisted on feeding her son herself. She handpicked every fold of his clothing and rocked him to sleep every single night. When Franklin turned 5 and his long, radiant blonde curls were finally cut, Sara gathered those locks of hair, stroked them, and carefully preserved them in a silk-lined box as if they were holy relics. The boy grew up under an unblinking gaze. Every breath he took and every step he made remained under his mother's absolute control. This was the origin of a deep psychological enmeshment. In the dark corners of her subconscious, Sara no longer saw herself and Franklin as 2 independent individuals with separate lives. They were a single unified entity. The utter terror of losing her one and only resource locked her soul in place. Having to share that boy with anyone else, especially a young woman holding the title of wife, felt to Sara like having a piece of her own body torn away. The house of sliding doors and the erasure of boundaries. The wedding day for Franklin and Eleanor finally arrived. Stepping into her role as a powerful and generous mother-in-law, Sara decided to present the young couple with a wedding gift that left New York high society buzzing. She purchased 2 elegant adjoining neoclassical townhouses at numbers 47 and 49 East 65th Street. From the outside, it stood as a symbol of protection, a perfect launching pad for married life. But inside it was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Sara personally hired the renowned architect Charles A. Platt to bring her vision to life. He created a perfect living space designed exclusively to serve a mother suffering from severe boundary enmeshment. Between the drawing rooms and dining rooms of the 2 houses, there were no solid brick walls to block out sound. Instead, Platt designed a highly sophisticated system of solid wood sliding doors. With just a gentle push, the 2 separate residences instantly merged into one. The existence of these sliding doors carried a chilling implication. Sara could leisurely slide them open and step straight into the private spaces, the drawing room, the dining room, or even loom right outside the young couple's bedroom at any hour of the day. She didn't have to put on a coat and step out into the frosty street, and she certainly didn't have to knock and wait for permission. The home was no longer a symbol of a new family. It had been transformed into a glittering golden cage. Money in this house was no longer a medium of exchange. It was the ultimate weapon of control. By paying for all the construction costs, personally selecting everything from the Persian rugs to the pear-drop chandeliers, and interviewing every single housemaid and cook, Sara entirely stripped Eleanor of her voice. Inside a house that bore her own married name, Eleanor didn't have the right to dictate the dinner menu or rearrange the furniture. This manipulation turned even more ruthless as the Roosevelt children began to arrive. Moving with the speed of a predator guarding its territory, Sara rushed in and seized the role of motherhood for herself. She personally selected the pediatricians, hired the nurses, and laid down strict rules for the children's feeding and sleeping schedules. For long, agonizing months at a time, she would order the trunks packed and take her grandchildren away to the sprawling grounds of Springwood or out to the windswept island of Campobello. Eleanor was left behind, sitting all alone in that massive hollow house in Manhattan. Decades later, Eleanor's eldest daughter, Anna, would bitterly recall her childhood, noting that she was raised far more by her grandmother's authority than by her own parents' embrace. Looking through the lens of family dynamics, a household can only function properly when there is a clear passing of the torch between generations. When a son marries a mother must step back and willingly shrink her sphere of influence to give the new couple room to breathe and grow. But Sara flatly rejected the laws of nature. She used a system of sliding doors to obliterate physical boundaries. She used her massive fortune to suffocate the boundaries of authority. By covering every single penny of their living expenses, she ensured that Eleanor would remain a powerless guest in her own life. Women trapped in a hunger for control often protect their standing by absolutely refusing to let another woman take up their space. And Eleanor, caught in that velvet trap, slowly began to wither away. The Lucy Mercer ultimatum and protecting honor with money. Eleanor's endurance was finally pushed to its breaking point in the fall of 1918. Franklin had just returned from a grueling mission in Europe, bringing home a severe case of the Spanish flu and double pneumonia. As the ambitious politician lay gasping for air on his sickbed, hovering on a very thin line between life and death, Eleanor quietly opened his suitcases to unpack his clothes. Hidden in the lining of a valise, she found a stack of letters. They were love letters. The sender was Lucy Mercer, a 23-year-old girl who was radiantly beautiful, incredibly charming, and ironically enough, had once served as Eleanor's own part-time social secretary. The passionate words spilled across the pages revealed an undeniable and cruel truth. Franklin had been having an affair for quite some time right under her nose. Eleanor's world entirely collapsed. Years of accumulated humiliation finally boiled over. She took the stack of letters, confronted Franklin, and decisively demanded a divorce. It was an act that required extraordinary courage for a woman in the social climate of that era. But that divorce, as history has recorded, never took place. It wasn't because their love was miraculously repaired. It was due to the cold, calculating, and ruthless intervention of Sara Delano Roosevelt. When Sara learned of the scandal, she didn't break down in tears. She didn't make a scene, and she absolutely didn't side with the betrayed woman to comfort her daughter-in-law. Instead, she walked into the sick room, looked straight at her ailing son, and delivered an ultimatum as sharp as a blade of ice. If Franklin dared to divorce Eleanor and run off with his mistress, she would immediately call her lawyers and strike his name permanently from her will. Not a single red cent of the massive Delano fortune would ever go to him. On top of that, the generous allowance that was entirely funding his family's lifestyle would be cut off that very day. And as a final fatal blow, Sara reminded him that a society divorce would permanently bury the political career he so desperately craved. Franklin, standing on the brink of losing both his inheritance and his ambition, had to bow his head. He swore he would never see Lucy again, though years later as president he would break that promise, and he agreed to maintain a sham marriage with Eleanor. From that autumn in 1918 onward, their physical and romantic life as husband and wife completely ended. They moved into separate bedrooms, locked their hearts away, and turned their marriage into a cold political partnership. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, their incredibly sharp-tongued and cynical cousin, enthusiastically spread rumors about this dead marriage throughout the elite tea parties of Washington, turning Eleanor's private pain into parlor gossip for high society. Sara's actions during this crisis unmask a terrifying reality. Preventing the divorce was not simply about protecting the family honor, though that made for a beautiful cover story. In truth, Sara was striking directly at Franklin's most vulnerable points, his greed for status and his deep-seated fear of poverty. She knew full well that if Franklin divorced and married Lucy Mercer, a young, captivating woman who was not bound by Sara's authority, he would permanently slip out of his mother's orbit. By using her money to force the continuation of a marriage that was rotting from the inside out, Sara proved a brutal truth about the patriarchal system. A woman in power is perfectly willing to crush the happiness and dignity of another woman and even sacrifice the romantic happiness of her own flesh and blood just to keep the power structure she sits upon completely intact. Polio and the battle for control. In 1921, the most devastating tragedy and the most defining turning point struck the Roosevelt family. Franklin contracted polio at the prime age of 39. The tall, imposing man who burned with ambition and walked with such confident strides was suddenly paralyzed, unable to even lift his own legs. While Franklin sank into a deep abyss of crisis and despair, somewhere in the dark corners of her mind, Sara saw a different path. According to several historians and quiet whispers within the family, Sara believed this was the absolute perfect time for Franklin to abandon the dirty, competitive world of politics forever. She demanded that he return to the Springwood estate and live out the rest of his days as an invalid country squire safely wrapped under his mother's wing. Down in the depths of her psychological enmeshment, her son's illness looked suspiciously like a golden opportunity. It was her chance to win Franklin back, completely tearing him away permanently from the influence of Eleanor and his devoted political advisor, Lewis Howe. She wanted to lock the doors to the outside world and keep him all to herself. But this time, Eleanor was no longer the weak, submissive daughter-in-law of her younger years. Together with Lewis Howe, she cast aside her usual reserve and fought fiercely to keep the fire of Franklin's political ambition alive. The war over the fate and the very life of this paralyzed man exploded between the two women, turning more ruthless than ever before. Sara relentlessly abused her privileges. She threw open those sliding doors connecting the Manhattan townhouses at all hours, marching in uninvited. She brought in private doctors she had hired herself, barked orders at the nurses, and completely trampled over every medical decision Eleanor tried to make for her husband. Unable to breathe under this suffocating control for another second, Eleanor made an incredibly powerful and symbolic act of rebellion. She walked over and permanently locked the doors connecting the two houses. This physical resistance felt like a slap in the face to Sara, sending the matriarch into an absolute rage. Furious that her boundaries of control had been blocked, Sara stormed up to her grandchildren, pointed a finger, and practically screamed a threat, declaring that she was far more of a mother to them than Eleanor ever was. Sara's boundary enmeshment had now reached a level of pure toxicity. She was wildly jealous of any effort Eleanor made to care for her husband. She wanted to monopolize every decision inside that sick room, and she constantly planted seeds of resentment and disrespect in the children's minds against their own mother. Deep in her subconscious, Sara truly believed that she was the only woman who mattered, the true mistress of both Franklin's life and his soul. However, Franklin, despite his broken body, still harbored a burning thirst for power. He ultimately chose to listen to the encouragement of Eleanor and Lewis Howe. He flatly refused to retreat into the shadows as a hidden invalid. For the very first time in the family's history, Sara's financial manipulation was entirely defeated by her son's hunger for greatness. The sanctuary of Valkill and the bride's escape, the irreparable cracks in her cold marriage to Franklin, combined with the draining clashes with her dictatorial mother-in-law, pushed Eleanor toward an unprecedented decision in the history of upper-class women. In 1926, Eleanor decisively packed her bags and moved out of the grand Springwood estate. She relocated to a modest stone cottage known as Valkill, situated just about a mile away. There she shared a living space with two close female friends, Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, creating a small independent community far away from the prying eyes of the world. Eleanor's deepest motivation wasn't simply to avoid looking at a husband who had betrayed her. It was a fierce rebellion, a desperate escape from the massive shadow of her mother-in-law's control. Eleanor had come to fully grasp a harsh reality. If she didn't physically break free from that occupied territory, she would forever remain a wandering shadow, a voiceless ghost living in someone else's house. She would inevitably repeat the tragedy of generations of women. Before her, those who simply gritted their teeth and endured until they closed their eyes for good inside the gilded tombs of the elite. Sara was utterly bewildered, disappointed, and furious about this decision. To her, a daughter-in-law leaving the family home was a profound insult. She complained bitterly to her circle of society friends, saying that Eleanor belonged right there at Springwood. She genuinely couldn't fathom why Eleanor had to trek over to that little cottage every single evening. If she just wanted to swim or relax, Sara reasoned, she could perfectly well do that during the day. Operating with the mindset of a ruler, Sara could never comprehend that the humble sanctuary of Valkill had become a radiant symbol of self-liberation. It was a great escape from a cruel patriarchal system that, ironically enough, was being maintained and enforced by another woman. A young bride could only truly grow up, find her voice, and take control of her own destiny by picking up a knife and cutting the spatial and financial umbilical cord tying her to her mother-in-law. Eleanor had realized that in this ruthless system, she was never going to be saved or freed by another woman who was too busy defending her own throne. To survive, she had no choice but to build a territory of her own. The double standard of a matriarchal queen. Sara's confusion and complaints regarding Eleanor's escape actually expose a profound internal contradiction, a chronic disease that plagued upper-class women of that era. It was the existence of an incredibly cruel double standard. At home pacing across expensive Persian carpets, Sara was a harsh, unyielding matriarch whom no one dared to cross. She fanatically upheld the strict standards of the Gilded Age, demanding docility, absolute obedience, and the preservation of the family's image above any personal feelings. She openly displayed her contempt for Eleanor's social work, especially when she saw her daughter-in-law associating with the poor, the working class, or people of color. To Sara, a woman carrying the Roosevelt name, a future First Lady lowering herself to visit destitute slums, was degrading behavior that stained the sacred Mayflower bloodline of their family. Yet the laughable and deeply ironic truth was that the moment Sara slipped on her mink coat and stepped out into society, she carefully crafted a completely opposite image for herself. She transformed into a remarkably generous donor and a benevolent society lady. She was perfectly willing to sign massive checks to support the Women's Trade Union League. She gave generously to the Legal Aid Society, and she even used her own money to help a black educator named Mary McLeod Bethune build a college. This dizzying contradiction wasn't entirely born of shallow hypocrisy. It was exactly how the social system operated and shaped the human mind. High society women were allowed, even encouraged and praised, to show progressive ideals, an independent spirit, and generous financial support for women's movements in public spaces where the press cameras were flashing. But the very second they stepped back through their own front doors, they had to shed that progressive skin and return to their posts as fiercely loyal gatekeepers of the patriarchal order. They were expected to use cruelty and unspoken rules to nail the next generation of women to traditional molds, stripping them of the very freedoms they were out championing in the streets. This is the painful core of a double standard that modern audiences can still feel today. Society is always quick to applaud women who are strong, sharp, and powerful in business or social causes. Yet it quietly demands that those exact same women shrink themselves down, becoming small, docile, understanding, and unconditionally submissive the moment they return home as a wife or a daughter-in-law. Sara Delano Roosevelt was both a victim and the most flawless executioner of that ruthless double standard. UHO was truly liberated the price and the legacy. To build the image of Eleanor Roosevelt as a towering hero and an immortal icon of the American feminist movement history, and the media chose the easiest possible route. They entirely demonized Sara Delano Roosevelt. For decades, biographies and articles have consistently painted Sara as a wealthy witch, a dictator hungry for control, and a deeply cruel woman. However, as the dust of time has slowly settled, modern historians have pointed out a painful paradox that forces us to ask a difficult question. In this story, who actually liberated Eleanor? If it hadn't been for Sara's suffocating financial grip, Eleanor would almost certainly never have had the chance to become the grand icon we know today. The harsh and deeply conflicting truth is this: because Sara used her vast fortune to cover all their lavish living expenses personally, signed the checks for their homes, poured massive funds into Franklin's endless political campaigns, and most importantly, shouldered the heavy, exhausting burden of raising and caring for 5 grandchildren, Eleanor finally got the one thing millions of ordinary women desperately craved. She had time and she had resources. Eleanor was free to travel the country, giving speeches fighting for women's rights, writing groundbreaking articles, and building a glorious independent political career at Valkill precisely because back at home there was another woman willingly carrying all the domestic duties that usually choke a career to death. The soaring freedom of one woman was built and rooted deeply in the manipulation, the hoarding, and the heavy lifting of the other. The sophisticated sliding doors meant for spying, the weaponized wills, and the ultimatums forcing a son to live in a sham marriage were all very real, and they carried incredibly destructive toxicity. But Sara's cruelty was the inevitable byproduct of a system programmed to force women into protecting their own meager power by stripping it away from another woman. Looking deeper, both Sara and Eleanor were tragic pawns in a zero-sum game of power where the rise of one woman absolutely required the loss and suppression of the other. And that doesn't even account for the fact that the financial foundation allowing Sara to establish a half-century-long reign actually stemmed from a very dark chapter of history. That massive fortune was built upon an opium smuggling empire in China operated by her father, Warren Delano. It was blood money heavy, with the suffering of tens of thousands of people which the family had painstakingly buried and perfectly whitewashed beneath layers of fine porcelain tea sets, prestigious marriages, and elegant aristocratic parlor gatherings. When Sara Delano Roosevelt took her final breath in September of 1941, her son was sitting at the absolute pinnacle of power in the free world, steering America through a devastating global war. She passed away, leaving behind the Springwood estate, an immense fortune, and a legacy of psychological control that helped forge a brilliant president while simultaneously carving permanent, unhealable wounds into the soul of her daughter-in-law. The story of Sara and Eleanor peels back the layers on an incredibly heartbreaking truth: cruel mothers-in-law. The women branded as villains are rarely born with wicked natures. They are women who were once deeply wounded, their roles severely restricted, forced to survive in marriages with massive age gaps, and pushed right to the invisible borders of medical life and death. The system taught them a brutal lesson. The only way to avoid being discarded, the only way not to be forgotten, was to maintain a tight grip on financial power and control the only resource they were ever allowed to have: the men in their lives. History has taken the easy way out by dividing these two women neatly into good and evil. But the true price of money and privilege in high society is not just found in cold transactional marriages or sprawling lonely mansions. The greatest cost, the greatest tragedy, is that the patriarchal system succeeded brilliantly in turning women, the very people who should have understood, embraced and liberated one another, into the most bitter and manipulative enemies inside their own homes. And that double standard, the one demanding a woman be strong in public but docile and submissive behind closed doors, seems to echo very loudly and very far long after those sophisticated sliding doors in New York were shut forever.